The death of General Grievous and Vader taking out the Separatist Council on Mustafar basically spelled the end for the CIS as a unified political entity. But some of the Separatist leaders still survived, and today we're going to talk about some of the most prominent leaders who were still left intact with few to no lightsaber wounds. This is going to fit into two semi-connected, semi-distinct categories, one being people who were already prominent leaders during the Clone Wars and what they got up to afterwards, and the other being the characters who took over some of the megacorporations after the original Separatist Council were killed, although they tend to also have been at least somewhere in the chain of command during the war as well, so they kind of fit into the first category too. We're going to start with that second group and take a look at what happened with the Banking Clan. When Chairman Son Hill was killed at Mustafar and the Banking Clan was technically no longer part of a rebelling faction, it wasn't dissolved by the Empire the same way that several of the other megacorporations were, given the important role the Banking Clan still played in galactic finance. It no longer operated as an independent organization under the Empire in the same way, though. The Muns maintained some level of control, but the Empire imposed their will through a new intermediary named Ricklon Tost. Tost had been the captain of the Eotrin Guard within the security division of the Banking Clan, responsible for the protection of high-ranking members. The Eotrins are basically a species with a strong military tradition, so you had a lot of these kind of mercenary groups or groups for hire, and the group that Tost led just happened to be one of the ones that probably got paid the best. Tost had fought for the Banking Clan during the war and was highly trusted by Hill and the other Moon leaders. During the negotiations after the war, Tost was credited with securing favorable terms for the IGBC to continue operations, as long as he remained as an intermediary between the Empire and the Muns. We don't really know what he offered the Empire for them to be okay with this, given that he wasn't really a loyalist to the Republic or the Empire before either, but he was successful enough at this that he outlasted even Palpatine, maintaining this position until at least the Yuzon Vong War, and keeping the IGBC at least somewhat intact. For the Trade Federation, nobody was quite as successful as Tost. Newt Gunray was replaced as acting viceroy by a Neimoidian named Centipeth Findos, who negotiated on behalf of the Trade Federation with the Empire, but was largely just a lackey signing over the remaining assets of the Trade Federation to the Empire, which then distributed them to various loyalist corporations, especially in the corporate sector, and the Trade Federation was pretty much dissolved. Not all of those constituent parts were happy about this arrangement, and the Federation did still have significant droid forces, many of whom were able to be locally reactivated after the shutdown signal. Customs Vizier Marath Voru decried Findos as a third-tier flunky, and began to lead an armed resistance against the Empire, facing off against Grand Moff and future Grand Admiral Octavian Grant in the Five Veils campaign, where he was ultimately defeated at the Battle of the Hook Nebula. This loss effectively ended organized Trade Federation resistance, but small groups continued to exist in some form for years. There wasn't really any hope of any of them establishing something like the Trade Federation again, and these remaining groups also had a complicated relationship with the Rebel Alliance, given that most remained card-carrying Separatists, who were then not allowed to directly join the rebellion. I've got a whole other video on that. But Federation privateers like Captain Blox Hatha did like this video and subscribe for more, while also cooperating on some level with the Alliance. There's not a ton to talk about organizationally with leaders for the other megacorporations. They tended to get absorbed in a similar way, but where we don't really hear about the same level of succession attempts. One thing I will add here is that while I'm focusing on Legends, the Disney canon book Reign of the Empire Mask of Fear by Alexander Freed has a lot of focus on the early Senate under the Empire, with a lot of emphasis on how senators from the CIS worlds were reintegrated. So while we're focusing more on specific characters today, if you want a kind of bird's eye view level of what this process probably looked like and how they were kind of treated as a block, that's a great place to check. It's also just generally a really good book. I highly recommend checking it out. That being said, we still do have some other specific military and political leaders to talk about, some of whom were affiliated with the larger megacorporations, and some of whom were part of other associated groups. After all, this was a confederacy of independent systems, not the highly centralized unitary state of super-dependent planets, or Hakusistip. That wouldn't look as good on thumbnails. So the idea that some of these groups could effectively hold out on their own in specific locations wasn't a far cry from how the early days of the war went anyways, even if a lot of the groups did get more intertwined as the CIS command structure solidified under General Grievous. Some of the surviving leadership did see the writing on the wall and simply abandoned the fight or fled, as was the case with one of the business people within the Commerce Guild, Iako Stark, who fled to the corporate sector after the Battle of Coruscant. He held out there for a while before accidentally decapitating himself, after which, as one does, he turned himself into a spider droid before being killed by an Imperial agent working with his son and his daughter, who was actually not his biological daughter and instead had come from an affair his wife had. Who says comic books are weird? Local resistance leaders had a variety of fates after the war too, so we're going to focus on 2 examples. Horn Ambogene from Tydain was one of the more prominent of these leaders, having been brought into the upper echelons of the CIS command structure by Dooku to help train other local resistance leaders across the galaxy. When the CIS fell, he continued fighting the Empire and eventually officially renounced his separatist leanings to lead the Brick Sector forces for the Rebel Alliance. Another local leader named Toma from Etcherin in Last of the Jedi had already been negotiating a treaty with the Jedi to end his group's involvement in the war before Order 66 had thrown a spanner in the works. His forces ended up cooperating with the Jedi against the Empire, helping provide passage to an asteroid base. Toma was actually secretly providing the Empire with information on this group, leading to the asteroid base's destruction by an Imperial superlaser, and Toma himself was killed by one of his allies who realized what he was doing. This brings us back to some of the other Separatists who tried to lead wider-scale operations against the Empire after the Clone Wars. First, we have Jizor Delso. Delso had been one of the architects of the droid shutdown signal, and after the war, he turned his Geonosian engineering experience to trying to rearm a droid army on Mustafar. So this was less a case of an originally high-ranking individual continuing the fight, and more a case of trying to restart production on a major CIS foundry world to build a new army. A few years after he started this work, he drew the attention of the Empire, and the 501st was dispatched to deal with him, successfully eliminating both him and his droid army. This southern to southeastern region of the galaxy was a hotbed for Separatist activity generally, and was home to our final 2 attempts to keep the CIS rolling. One, which we know a little bit less about, was led by an Aqualish general named Kendu Oltho, who joined forces with the Osca pirates led by Gun Cutlix in 17 BBY, 2 years after the war's end. They were taken on as part of the Imperial Western Reaches operation, where Admiral Terranald Screed and Rising Star fighter pilot Shea Hublin eliminated Oltho and his pirate allies. Finally, we have one of my favorite of the CIS holdout leaders just for her name, Senator Tumbuk Tora of Psi Mirth, who'd established significant resistance to the Empire near Hutt space shortly after the war's end. It was attempting to restart production of the Separatist war machine in the region formerly known as the Foundry of the Confederacy. Future rebel leaders Admiral Adar Talon and General Yondo Donna pushed her forces from Diado and Metalorn before sieging Psi Mirth and engaged Tora's own flagship Defiance's banner at Trasimene, killing her and ending the Psi Mirthian resistance. This isn't an exhaustive list of every CIS member after the Clone Wars, but it is a lot of the more notable CIS leaders and their activities after the war. Thank you for watching, I hope you've enjoyed the video. This idea actually came from a comment which I can no longer find actually, so let me know if there's something else you'd like to see covered on the channel in the comments as well, and hopefully I'll be able to find those ones in the future. Thanks again, and hope to see you next time.